Hey everybody, this is Michael and Dillon in our 8th episode of From Guns to Keyboards. We're going to give a bit of a wrap up on the main events happening in the Middle East affecting Israel. From there, we're going to dive into our main question of this podcast. What is the connection between ego and war, and what role does revenge have to play in that? Some major events happening in the Middle East. After Israel targeted a senior Iranian commander in Syria, the Iranians are threatening retaliation. A report that was leaked to the Wall Street Journal indicates that Iran is threatening to retaliate sometime within the next 24 to 48 hours, so we may be in for an interesting weekend here in Israel. In addition to that, we have the ongoing negotiations that are taking place between Israel and Hamas, brokered through multiple third-party partners of Israel and Hamas, where the two sides are discussing a potential short-term ceasefire in exchange for a partial release of the hostages. We have the potential for escalation in the north with Hezbollah, where since October 8th, Israel and Hezbollah have been exchanging fire in an ongoing war of attrition. Neither side seems to be interested in a full-on war, but every day that goes by, both sides are slowly pushing the other forward, and it remains to be seen whether this will blow out into a full-on war. We are seeing Israel significantly reduce its troop presence in the Gaza Strip from what started out in the beginning of the war to upwards of 4 entire divisions maneuvering through the Gaza Strip to a single brigade that is holding a logistical corridor in the Gaza Strip alongside troops that are carrying out pinpointed raids throughout the Strip, mainly in the northern and central Gaza Strip. This is a huge turning point in the Israel-Gaza war, where we are seeing Israel move towards much more targeted strikes and pinpointed activity. Finally, we have the question of Rafah, where many of us are asking whether or not this turning point in the Israel-Hamas war is part of some Israeli strategy to gather its troops together for Rafah, or if it's a signal of some sort of slow end to the fighting that's broken out since the October 7th massacre. And on the domestic front, we have Israelis coming out against the government, and in particular against Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, calling for an immediate hostage deal to take place. We're seeing that the tone of the protest is shifting from what started out as an apolitical movement to call for a deal to be reached between Israel and Hamas to a very political movement that's focused on removing Prime Minister Netanyahu and replacing him with another figure that can bring about a hostage deal. All this is taking place in the shadow of Passover, which is going to be marked in Israel in the next couple of weeks. The theme of liberty and freedom that typically marks this Jewish holiday is mixed with the background of what's happening in the Gaza Strip and the ongoing suffering of 133 hostages that are still in captivity. That's the main news points that we're looking at today in the Middle East and specifically in Israel. And from there, let's go ahead and talk about today's podcast.
Yeah, ego and revenge. I feel like this is one that we've kind of been avoiding a little bit, maybe danced around it a few times, talking about. I think you and I really try and keep things clinical and pragmatic. At the end of the day, we're all human beings, and most, if not all of us, are ruled by our emotions and by our ego as well. And that certainly translates into war, and that's certainly been visible in this war as well. So, in terms of today's discussion, ego and revenge and war, I think, why don't we tie it to the biggest thing happening in Israel right now, which is, of course, the impending Iranian strike. How much of this do you think is a strategic necessity on Iran's part, and how much of this is just ego and showcasing?
I think on the Iranian side, they are looking at this strike that happened in Syria as quite similar to what happened with Soleimani not so many years ago. From their perspective, this is the assassination of a very senior officer that cannot go unanswered. And I think from one aspect, you really can look at a genuine Iranian need to re-achieve quote unquote deterrence in its shadow war, I guess you can call it, against the state of Israel. But it has to be said that in addition to the ongoing shadow war that's happening between both sides, where each side is aiming to deter the other, Israel and Iran, it has to be said that the Iranians and the Israelis here are, of course, acting in a way that gives a answer both to their own egos as politicians and to the domestic expectation of what a country ought to do in order to save face and preserve its honor. And I think that ego, revenge, and war really do connect to that greater point of honor here, where from the Iranian perspective, they cannot let this strike go, not just from a desire of attaining deterrence, but out of a real need, an emotional need to save face and get revenge.
Yeah, I really wonder too, because, it's interesting that we're talking about states and tying states into the concept of honor culture, which is very much, I think, well and alive, particularly in the Middle East. And it's a concept that I think that as Americans, we have kind of trouble wrapping our heads around because, as Americans, we've basically accepted that state institutions run our lives and that we sacrifice a lot of our ties to family and community in exchange for obedience to the state. Obviously in American history, we have examples of the Hatfields and McCoys, which are, family blood feuds. But these are always, it's kind of like novelties. It's sort of like a charming novelty in American history. It's not something that anybody takes particularly seriously. Whereas here in Israel, this concept of blood libel and blood feuds and honor wars is very much alive and well. I say Israel, I meant that the Middle East as a whole. And we can kind of see this in many ways translated into state power as well. Where, look, there is very much, I think there is a logical consistency to saying that, hey, if you attack us, you can't just walk away with it scot-free. But there is also, I think, a cultural aspect at play here. And I wonder if the sort of logical, talk of deterrence isn't just kind of a shield that you can use to hide behind for that real cultural innate desire of honor and revenge.
Honor, revenge, and attaining a picture of victory. I think we're seeing this quite clearly in addition to the Israel-Iran front, also in the north, where both sides have made it very clear that neither Israel nor Hezbollah are interested in a full-on war, but neither side is willing to back down. Now, obviously, going back to the same analogy to Iran, you can look at it from a perspective of deterrence, that both Hezbollah and Israel want to deter the other side and are therefore exchanging in limited rounds of fire in order to achieve that deterrence. But I think the greater issue here is one of honor, that neither side is willing to deal with that ego or that their pride has been wounded in this ongoing war. And both are trying to achieve some sort of picture of victory that they can present to their own publics. And that's kind of what's, in a very significant way, fueling this ongoing limited war between Israel and Hezbollah. And it looks like this limited war in the north is now going to expand to Iran.
Yeah, and it's very much working in favor of Hezbollah as well. I mean, one thing that we've seen come out of Lebanon recently is prior to this war, Hezbollah was extremely unpopular in Lebanon. They were seen there were, within the past several years, multiple protests and attempted protests against the Lebanese-controlled sectors of the government and economy, which were immediately beaten back by Hezbollah. I mean, they are still a very strong and supported military, or strong and functional military force. But post October 7th and post the engagement, many Lebanese are actually looking to Hezbollah as their only chance of deterring a full-scale Israeli invasion. That only Hezbollah will prevent Israel from actually coming into southern Lebanon and leveling it in an attempt to push the Lebanese beyond the Litani River. I also, this concept too of honor and of revenge as well. I mean, this is also something that we've heard from numerous supporters of Palestinian, we'll be generous and call them Palestinian resistance. This idea of, when you speak to a lot of people who are very much in the corner of violent Palestinian resistance, they tell you, well, what do you expect? What did you expect to happen when you were blockading us and you were economically strangling us and this and this and this? What do you expect? You're going to be attacked. You're like, this has to happen. The Palestinians have to regain their sense of honor and control over this situation and cannot just be subordinate to Israel and cannot then come, because there is a pragmatic point, right? There is the pragmatic idea of, look, if the Palestinians came forward and said, all right, we're renouncing violence. We're renouncing violence. We just want a state. Give us a state. That's it. I think in all likelihood they'd have a state. I think it'd be very hard to ignore. I think the whole reason they don't is because the Israeli right would just point to Hamas and say, well, how can we make a state when these people are just consistently threatening to annihilate us? And had that ego been put aside and had they simply come forward in a more peaceful movement, the outcome would have been very different. But there is this sense of, well, we can't do that because it's coming from a position of weakness, which, look, I can say as an Israeli, I can say as someone who works in business in Israel, Israelis will do anything to not be in a position, and it's a Middle Eastern thing as well, I believe, to not be in a position of weakness. We had, as a quick aside, at work, we had a lesson from someone who's actually a hostage negotiator for the Shin Bet, for Israel's internal, basically the Israeli FBI, who told us that, statistically speaking, Israelis are more likely than almost any other culture to blow up a deal if they don't feel like they're in the power seat. The second being, I think it was Saudi Arabian, perhaps? It was one of the Middle Eastern countries. That if they don't feel like they're in the power seat, they would rather blow up a great deal if they don't feel like they're in charge.
I agree with you. I would take it a little bit further beyond the Middle Eastern angle to an even greater human angle. I do definitely think that there is specific aspects to cultures in the Middle East that tend to promote this notion of honor and notions of national pride and cultural pride and pride in your people that isn't necessarily present in other groups of people or in other ethnic and religious groups throughout the world. But I think by and large, what we're looking at here from an anthropological perspective is a fundamental human desire to achieve the personal growth or to give an answer to their own personal ego as a way to achieve a sense of national belonging or ethnic belonging that makes them feel part of the group. And I think one of the recent events that happened in the news that we didn't get to talk about in the beginning of the episode that plays out quite well into this conversation about honor and ego and revenge and war is a airstrike that happened in the Gaza Strip over the past week, where Israel targeted three sons of one of Hamas's leaders in Qatar, three sons of Ismail Haniyeh, who were suspected of carrying out terrorist activity in the Gaza Strip. His three sons are killed in this airstrike. The news gets passed along to the Hamas leader in Qatar, and Ismail Haniyeh refers to this as a great honor. And he refers to this as, this is something that I am going through. This is something that the Palestinian people as a nation are going through, and he referred to their death as the greatest honor that could be. Now, many in the West may look at this as a particularly cultural aspect of Palestinian national politics that doesn't necessarily play out the same way in other countries, and that might be true. But I think that the core element that we are seeing here in these comments on this airstrike, and in general when we talk about war from this angle, is really this basic human desire to show how strong you are, to show how tough you are, especially men, to batter your ego as much as you possibly can, and to brandish your ego as much as you possibly can, and to connect that with your group that you're a part of, to say that you doing what you're doing, the sacrifices that you made, the sweat that the blood, sweat, and tears that you invested in this cause is all a part of this greater national desire that your group is trying to promote.
We're all still just kids on the playground, just trying to push each other off the swing, basically. Yeah, it certainly is interesting, the shift in the way someone like Hania would view his death, whereas someone like would view his son's death, whereas someone like our own General Eisenkot, who also lost his son during the war, there was a great sense of mourning and sadness. I wonder if that comes from the idea of our two people struggle, this idea of Palestinian resistance being inevitable, whereas for us, it was something that we wish to avoid, this kind of war. Us being the defender rather than the instigator.
I think you bring up a really interesting comparison there, where for those of our listeners who aren't aware, Gadi Eisenkot, who is a member of Israel's war cabinet and a former chief of staff of the Israel Defense Forces, lost his son in battle during the Gaza Strip. His son drafted to the war effort, like many young Israelis did. And when this happened, this was a major shock to the nation that Gal, his son, was killed in the fighting. And you can clearly see from a cultural perspective a fundamental difference in how loss is viewed from a Palestinian perspective and from an Israeli perspective, where you see two leading politicians on either side of this conflict reacting in very different ways to their son's death. But I actually think that there is some sort of common denominator here, where even though there is this sense of martyrdom that is more present in Palestinian national culture that doesn't really exist in the same way in Israeli culture, where Israelis tend to look at death in this way as not an honorable thing, but as a terrible tragedy that befell their family. I do think there is this common denominator here where both peoples expect from themselves, especially the men, to do whatever they can to fight and defend the honor of their country. And that is the highest level of honor that you can achieve as a person, where you say, I'm going to sacrifice everything that I have, including my own life, in order to both give a immediate response to my own personal ego and my own desire to basically prove my worth to society, and to, of course, fight for the very society that I'm a part of. And I think that on that point, that's not necessarily a Middle Eastern thing. I think that's something that you see in the United States. I think it's something that you see in other countries. The individual expression is quite different and has certain cultural adaptations depending on how honor is viewed in that society and how it plays out into questions of martyrdom and other interesting cultural phenomena. But I think by and large, the common denominator there is really one of an expectation of we as humans, and particularly of men, to give up everything that they can for the sake of honor, ego, pride, and of course, at the operational end of things, revenge.
That is actually very interesting, and I had not considered it in such a way, but I think you're right. I think it's essentially in Israeli and Western culture left unsaid in a way, whereas Ismail Hania was very open about, this is an honor that is happening to me and my family. The fact that anyone is even acknowledging it in such a solemn and respectful way, the death in battle of the son of whether it be Gadi Eisenkot or Ismail Hania, it is an honor. It's just the only difference is that in Palestinian and more Middle Eastern society, more Arab society, the sort of, its honor is something that is spoken about very openly in society. So it's very normal to say this is an honor. Doesn't mean it's not a tragedy, doesn't mean that they're not sad, they're not in mourning, but that it is an honor. Whereas in Israeli society, in Western society, it is also an honor, but the honor is put we don't really speak about honor in our society. It seems like such a strange medieval kind of romantic cultural custom to speak of honor. Like someone comes and says, "Oh, you're an honorable person." What does that mean? I'm honorable. Like you respect me? Okay. Um, it is in a sense that it is being acknowledged that the country stopped and from what I understand, most people watched the funeral of Eisencoat's son of Gal as it was being played live. That is a great honor to that family. It's just we don't speak about it in that way.
So I would love to take this conversation to a personal level, because so far we've been talking about how honor affects big power politics and Middle Eastern politics and Israel and the Palestinians and the Iranians and Hezbollah. And I think that maybe we might draw some interesting insights if we talk a little bit about our own experience as two reservists that went off to participate in the war effort. How did you see that honor and ego and revenge play out one way or another in your own service during the war?
Wow, it very much felt like a revenge mission for me at the beginning. Like when we went into Gaza in those first 2 weeks, we were attached to infantry unit operating out of the Erez crossing point. We would go in behind them as a Yalom unit does. What we would do is we were essentially looking for tunnels. We were there to explode any enemy ordnance we found and infrastructure. But what ended up happening is, yes, we did blow up a number of tunnels, but we mostly just blew up buildings, just homes. And we asked our officers, like, why? Why are we doing this? What is the point of blowing up this building? And I spoke about it in another episode as well, because what we were told was like, this is the mission. That was it. That's all we were told. And I think there was some politics at play, but at the end of the day, what it felt like to me was we just want to blow stuff up. We want to hurt people. We want to stack bodies. I think anyone, even at the very beginning, when Bibi Netanyahu was saying, we're going to overthrow Hamas and we're going to do this, I don't really think, I don't know. Me personally, I didn't believe him. I didn't think that was possible, especially not in the way that the Israelis were going about it. I mean, you and I are Americans. We lived through Iraq and Afghanistan. We know that overthrowing an insurgent force in their native home is not an easy task at all. And especially when you're just not even indiscriminately, but let's say very, very light on the trigger when it comes to bombing, you're certainly not going to be winning anybody over to your cause. And it really just felt like, and I remember even saying this to a lot of my buddies at the time, it really just feels like Israel wants to stack bodies. And I think this is where also we tend to see a lot of the looting, a lot of the TikTok videos of soldiers blowing up homes, of graffiti on walls, things like that. It was revenge. There was this feeling of, you guys did this to us, October 7th, and now we're in the driver's seat, and we're taking control.
And I would love to hear about how that worked personally for you, because you're talking a lot about how the Israeli response, in your opinion, on a grand scale, or at least at the scale of your unit that you served in, seemed to be very focused on revenge, on the things that you mentioned. But I would love to hear a little bit more about how that played out into what you were seeking as a person, what you were what you were aiming to achieve in this war. Obviously, nobody asked your opinion before the war, before you were drafted, as to whether or not you wanted to draft or not. You're required by law to draft. But do you think that in retrospect you had any personal aims that you wanted to achieve in your participation in this war?
I mean, honestly, yeah, I wanted to do what everybody wanted to do. I wanted to kill people in Hamas. That's 100% what I wanted to do. I wanted to hurt somebody. I wanted to kill people. I remember seeing bombs go off and being excited. And, the Israelis get a lot of criticism in the past Gaza wars, where people will set up, blankets and have picnics on the rooftops of the outlying cities and kibbutzim and cheer the Israeli Air Force as they bomb. And I very much felt that excitement when I was in Gaza and I was watching these bombs go off. And for me, there is this feeling, this very overwhelming feeling of being part of just this incredibly powerful system. Like these bombs and these tanks and all this artillery going off around you, it's not for you specifically, but in a way it's for you. It is there to help you do your job. These are and to see that happening, it gives you this feeling of power that is unlike anything I think you can experience in the normal world. Maybe even, I don't know, I've never been a high powered businessman, obviously, but even outside of that, where you truly become this sort of just force of death and destruction that is just being unleashed on the world. And for the Israelis, especially at the beginning, I mean, the gloves were off. There was not even, it's not like now where we see more targeted attacks and targeted missions. The beginning, it was, I mean, we were blowing up residential homes, and I definitely thought, I looked at it at the time, I was like, this is good practice for us. We need this because we've all been out of the army for quite a few years. We've been working civilian jobs. We never thought we'd be in a war like this. This might not have any military necessity to what we're doing, but it's good practice because who knows, in a month or two, we might be deep into Gaza City or Han Yunis or wherever, where we might be doing these kind of operations surrounded by insurgents. And it's important for us, at least in the beginning, to make these mistakes. And we made a lot of mistakes. But we made it in this northern area, which was largely evacuated, in which we came under very small, sporadic fire, nothing that we couldn't handle. And it felt, to me, the moral question wasn't even in my head. I understood what we were doing certainly did not align with the Geneva Conventions and the laws of war. I understood that at the time. And I remember even cynically, they would tell us, oh, hey, you got your next mission. And I would say, like, yay, more war crimes, like in a sarcastic kind of way. But it was, because it was that. And I was just sort of like pushing down any like real introspective thought with just humor. But that's what was very much happening. It was very much a war of revenge. That feeling of wanting to just hurt anyone who's even in the remotest way connected to Hamas was, I mean, yeah, it was there.
Do you connect that at all to ego?
Yes and no. I mean, at the end of the day, both, like, ego is meant to kind of protect us in a certain sense. It's meant to keep us, when we look at ego in a social setting, if someone puts you down in front of a group of friends or your girlfriend or whatever, the ego is a thing telling you to, hey, reassert yourself and reassert your social status in the situation. It is there to protect you. Sometimes it goes too far and ends up actually being detrimental, but a healthy ego is one that is telling you when you're in danger, maybe not even in physical danger, but in other types of social danger, or in professional danger even, something of that sense. So in a way, there is certainly an instinctive part of you that, as we kind of mentioned, you want to show that you're the biggest, baddest bully on the playground. That if someone hits you, you're going to hit them back twice as hard. And that is very much coming from a place of ego. Because a place of rationality, if we were purely rational creatures, I think we would have understood that, okay, this attack happened on October 7th. What is the most rational response to it? And that rational response might have looked something a bit more like the operations that we saw at Al-Shifa, the hospital there. It's like, let's do everything we can to avoid any civilian destruction. Let's just do targeted strikes against Hamas and its operatives, and that's it. But that's not what we did. We did the opposite. And it definitely felt good, and it felt reassuring, I think, to the Israeli public to see that. And I remember coming back, too, on a couple of breaks, and I would speak to people about northern Gaza, and we blow up homes, and they would say, great, they're all Hamas. And I'd be like, to be honest, they're not. Like, I've been in their homes. These are people who they have, condoms in drawers, and they have, signs, beer posters on the walls. These are not fundamentalists at all. I don't see these people voting for Hamas from what I saw of their personal possessions. They might be Muslims, they might be devout Muslims, but they don't seem like fundamentalists. But at the time, and actually learning more about Gaza and the way it's socially stratified, you learn that people in the north, because they have such, they have a lot of interaction working in Israel. Most of the workers who come into Israel would come through that northern crossing. As a result, most of them are not Hamas supporters. They are considered the lefties of Gaza, the people who are much less fundamentalist, much more secular. Han Yunis was a different story. Han Yunis, you could really feel the sort of in the way that they decorated their homes and their arts and things like that. This was a very, very much more conservative Islamic style of a community.
I think you bring up an interesting point where you talk about to what degree do the Palestinians support Hamas, and specifically to what degree do the residents of the Gaza Strip support Hamas? And I think that specific issue can also be tied into the greater question of ego, where I don't necessarily think that every Hamas supporter is a fundamentalist, Islamist, let's bring about a caliphate that will take over the entire world. I think you definitely will see some degree of fundamentalism in some parts of the Gaza Strip, especially in Khan Yunis, where that is a major ideological Hamas stronghold, as you mentioned yourself. But I definitely think Hamas does get some degree of support, not necessarily from fundamentalists, but from people who look at them as the organization that is defending their honor. The men that go out and not only protect their own sense of self and pride and ego, but protect the nation. And I think that can explain a lot of the dissonance between the seemingly secular behavior of some of the residents of the Gaza Strip, where you look at these individuals and you say, these are Western individuals that have similar cultural characteristics to many other countries in Europe and in the Americas. But on the other hand, you do still see widespread support for Hamas amongst a lot of these people. And I think a lot of it can be explained not necessarily by ideological similarities, but by this basic human innate desire to say, these are my guys, they're fighting against the other team on the other side of the fence. I'm going to support my guys over those guys, and I'm going to do anything that I can to bring about victory for us.
Absolutely. And this is exactly the same problem that the Americans ran into in their war in Iraq and Afghanistan, where it didn't matter how benevolent the Americans were. At the end of the day, this is an outside force coming into your home and your country, and you're not going to stand for that kind of behavior. And if someone is pushing back against them, then you're going to be on that side, regardless of whatever end goal that your team might have in mind. I think you're absolutely right about that. That being said, I mean, look, we do know from very well detailed and well documented polling numbers before October 7th that Hamas did not have a lot of support in the Gaza Strip, and I would imagine, based on what I've seen, that a lot of that came from a lot of the neighborhoods that we were in. How do people feel now? Good question.
Look, these polls go back and forth. We've also spoken about this in previous conversations. It's not clear how accurate these polls are. Some polls show widespread, almost universal support for Hamas and its policies. Some polls show that Hamas is the most unpopular organization in the Gaza Strip. It goes both ways. It's quite difficult to get accurate polling in areas of the Middle East where the people in these areas don't necessarily feel comfortable expressing an opinion one way or another. They don't know who's speaking to them. They don't know who's on the other side.
The survey I'm referring to in this case it's called Arabarometer. It's widely considered to be one of the most accurate because of the extreme measures it takes to go around a lot of exactly what you were saying, to gain the trust of the people on the ground. And according to their findings prior to October 7th, they found that less than a third of Gazans actually approved of Hamas and its policies, which is even considered by some to be one of the reasons why Hamas was so eager to attack on October 7th, which was to reassert itself politically within Palestinian national consciousness.
Right. Look, let's go off from the shared starting point that this poll is 100% accurate, and the way that they referenced Palestinian political opinion at that time was 100% true, just so we can have a conversation based on shared language, at least with reference to this poll. Even if we're only talking about a third here, I think that one has to differentiate between political support and core human-based identification with a group that you're a part of, right? At the end of the day, it doesn't matter how you cut the cake, Hamas is their team. These are their guys. I think it's the same thing in Israel, where well under a third of the Israeli population supports the Israeli prime minister, and I saw a recent poll that 70% of Israelis want the prime minister removed. But at the end of the day, this is an us versus them kind of game, and they look at it the same way. The Palestinians look at this war the same way that we look at this war, where this is our team, this is their team, and we're going to support our team as much as we possibly can in order to achieve victory the way that we understand victory. And when I say we, I'm saying we both from an Israeli perspective and we both from a Palestinian perspective. So, like I said, this poll might be 100% accurate, but I think there's a deeper question here of what does support actually mean? Does support mean that you're going to go out to the ballot box and vote for them? Or does support mean that you're going to, at your core, identify with your group? Because that...
Look, when you're speaking about, the sort of duality during war of my team versus your team, that's one thing. But when you look at the sort of, when it's during peacetime and where you tend to look internally, that's where you see a lot of fractures, divisions begin to happen. And it really, when you look at to sort of how Gaza was prior to October 7th, it doesn't really shock me that so many Gazans would not be happy. I mean, Gaza has a very high level of education and a very low level of opportunity. Economically, on the global index, they're extremely low. Most Palestinians, as a group, tend to be very secular. And we heard stories from a lot of Gazans. Post-October 7th, I've heard stories from a lot of Gazans publishing online saying things how, like, they would be out to a cafe with, like, a female friend, and they would have the Hamas's morality police come over to them being like, what's the situation? Are you two married? Why are you two sitting together? Like, coming up to people and really, policing not only just what's happening on the streets, but their intimate lives as well. It wouldn't shock me that a lot of Palestinians would be saying, all right, this is not acceptable to me. And beyond that, you had a lot of internal divisions within just Hamas as well, where you have the more, hardline stance, like by Sinwar, who wanted just maximalist Hamas, Palestinian gains of removing Israel from the map, versus other Hamas leaders who, we saw, for instance, in the revised Hamas charter in 2017, which I don't know if revised is the right word, but maybe more trying to frame the original charter and saying things like, our issue is not with the Jews, it's with the Zionists. We're not necessarily only going to stop for a one state Palestinian solution, but we might be okay with something like the 1967 borders as well. You saw that internal division, which has now been largely quenched by, or has ended, I would say, rather, by the October 7th attacks, which did two things, which ended a lot of internal divisions within the Hamas political parties. We now see that Sinwar is very much in control. Even during the negotiations, there's lots of reports that one of the reasons why negotiations happen so slowly is because they need to wait for Sinwar's answer, and he is somewhere underground in Gaza, which means communicating with him is extremely difficult even for Hamas. And two, we've seen, and again, this is where the reports where I'm not sure how much to believe, because these are seeming like very hastily done polls. Unlike the air barometer, which is something that takes months to complete, these are ones within several weeks post October 7th. You saw polls saying that, the vast majority of Palestinians support Hamas. And look, I have to say, if I were a Palestinian and I saw people taking the streets with a Hamas flag and I thought Hamas might be the ruling government pretty soon, I would also, and someone came to my house and was like, hey, just, taking a poll here. What do you think? I would probably say I support Hamas too, to avoid any trouble for myself or my family. But anyway, that's just to I think maybe we're getting a little bit off track here on this one, but that's sort of my opinion of internal division in peacetime versus war, and we see it on both sides.
And look, you may be right. The very point that you're mentioning about how peacetime is different from wartime and how war really rallies the people together really does connect to the topic that we're talking about, which is this basic notion of, at the end of the day, once it comes down to question of national honor and connecting that national honor to personal ego, the internal divisions fizzle away. And if there were internal divisions in Gaza amongst the Palestinian public before October 7th, it seems as if a significant amount of these internal divisions may have fizzled out in the months afterwards. I want to take this conversation to another place when we talk about ego.
Well, wait, before we do, what about you? You put me on the spot with my personal experiences. What about you and your personal experiences? How did you feel at the outset of the war? How did ego or revenge affect the war experience for you?
So I remember at the beginning of the war, at the time on October 7th, I was waking up in a hotel room in Holland. I just celebrated a week with my fiance in Holland and in Belgium. Traveling after our engagement the week prior, and I wake up the morning of October 7th. It was supposed to be the last day of our trip, to the horrifying news coming out of Israel, the terrible massacre perpetrated by Hamas terrorists that crossed the border and raped and tortured and killed and mutilated. And in this terrible tragedy that happened in Israel, I saw slowly developing in the days afterwards a amazing aspect of Israeli society coming to full fruition, where Israelis from all corners said, we are going to draft and support the war effort. Israelis flew in from all over the world. Israelis who were already in Israel at the time came in and drafted to their units. Israelis that typically didn't do reserve duty before the war all of a sudden found themselves putting on uniform and going to draft. And I was definitely a part of that national feeling, where I myself knew that there was no other way of going around this. I had to go into the draft and I had to support the war effort. The second that I got back to Israel, it took me 2 days to get back because all the flights got canceled. The second I got back to Israel, and on October 9th, I immediately drafted to my unit and started serving. And at the time, I remember feeling this incredible sense of personal pride and national pride and love of the country, which I still feel till today, that I think is incredible to see the way a country just comes together during a war effort to defeat its enemies. But I can say with some degree of retrospect in the months afterwards, when I look back on what happened, I do think there was this other component that was a part of this national pride, which I would define as ego. And I think this ego tend to be quite present specifically amongst men that wanted to draft to the war effort, but not necessarily only amongst men. Many women also drafted to the war effort and continue to serve until today. I think that the feeling in Israel at the time and till today is, if you're a man and if you're an Israeli period, you have to draft to the war effort. And if you don't, nobody will say anything to your face. But if you don't, you're not a real Israeli. You're not a real man. You're not doing what the country expects of you and what you ought to expect of yourself. And I think that we really saw these masculine, ego-driven games play out in the war on social media, right? I think that, we saw in the initial weeks after the war that one of the first things that Israelis did after they drafted was post on social media, them in uniforms, especially when, tactical gear was starting to be distributed among soldiers. The first thing that any male soldier did at the time was to upload a picture of himself in his tactical gear, with his gun, with his vest, with everything. And, I think that I'm saying all of what I'm saying to both reference the positive of, seeing a country really coming together during a war effort and how beautiful that is on the one hand, But on the other hand, you kind of raise your eyebrow in retrospect and saying how much of this is really nationalism and Zionism, and how much of it is ego, and specifically male ego.
Like personal fulfillment in a way.
Exactly. Personal fulfillment, because once you do your part in the war effort, you're not just serving the nation, you're really proving to your immediate community, you're proving to yourself, and especially the male members of your community, that you do what's expected of you. You did your part. You risked your life. You trained to fight against the enemy. You put the enemy at risk of his own life, and you might have even killed the enemy on the battlefield. And these are things that it's not necessarily spoken about in a completely open way in Israel, but I think it's pretty much understood that if you're a man in Israel and you're of draft age, anywhere above the age of 20 and below the age of 40, and you don't serve in the war effort, nobody will say anything to you, but a thought will cross someone's head of what's going on here.
There was actually, too, what was so interesting was there was a lot of anger. I remember we talked about it with myself and my teammates. A lot of anger at people who weren't drafting, who either, they didn't draft or they weren't able to or whatever, and were just living their normal lives. I really wonder, I don't know if we really want to go this direction. But I really wondered, because this came at a time, we have to look at all this in the context of what was happening. In 2023, there was, 2023, you have the feminist movement is in full swing. I mean, you're reading articles being like, are men obsolete? and really this question of what, aside from maybe some innate biological urges and separate genitalia, what separates men and women? And then suddenly, you have now this return to a very traditional form of masculinity.
Right. And
I think a lot of guys really embraced that and really accepted that wholeheartedly, particularly in Israel, which is, I would say, much more conservative and traditional than the United States. But I don't know. I wonder if that was maybe part of what was fueling all this sort of eagerness to jump into battle.
In my opinion, it definitely was a huge part, the aspect of male ego. I don't know what is really behind that in terms of the modern cultural context or the biological aspect of it, but I definitely think that male ego played a significant role. Not to say, obviously, I'll state the obvious, that many women do serve in the IDF, and this is not to say that this is a purely man thing.
True, but I think a lot of,
can look at it, as a particular.
Well, a lot of Israeli women have been quick to point out too that when you look at the war cabinet, who are the people at the top making the decisions? They're all men.
Right.
And you look at the IDF generals who have now been elevated in society. IDF generals, say what you want about them, most of them are not very pro-feminist. And what is that potentially going to do to Israeli culture?
Right. And I think that, we were speaking a little bit earlier about how this masculinity played out in social media in a more benign fashion of Israeli soldiers uploading pictures of themselves in tactical gear with guns and vests and their helmets and what have you. But I think you also saw this phenomenon take place in other aspects, right? You saw Israelis uploading pictures on social media of them graffitiing homes in Gaza. You saw Israelis showing all these images of themselves doing things that I don't necessarily think can be explained purely by a desire for national pride. I think part of it is the sense of nationalism. I think a lot of it is really just about me. It's about you and your Facebook account and your X account showing the world, I did my part. I, as a man, crossed the border. Yeah. I went into Gaza. I risked my life, tried to kill members of Hamas, and look at how much of a man I am. I even had the time to graffiti this home and show them who's boss.
I mean, it certainly hasn't helped the Israeli war effort. If anything, it's harmed it. You see news outlets across the world are picking up on soldiers, walking around with Gazan women's lingerie or blowing up homes or whatever else they might be doing. And it's been people have used this as evidence that Israelis are, either just immorally repugnant, inherently bad people. On the flip side, you have Hamas, who is very much, and this is what kind of drives a lot of Israelis crazy, is that Hamas has almost gotten to the point where it feels like if they kill an Israeli soldier and they don't capture it in a way on film, in a way that they can edit into one of their very sort of like quick edited, catchy videos that they do, then it's almost been a waste. It's been a waste of an operation, because throughout the entire war, and even just before coming here, they recently uploaded a video of an ambush they did on an Israeli unit operating in Gaza, which they successfully killed, I think, 2 soldiers. They've been uploading these photos constantly, and for them, it's a sign of, like, despite them tactically losing ground day after day after day, these videos are a show of force to their supporters, saying, look, the resistance is still here. We haven't been beaten. We're still fighting. We're still killing. We're still doing what we're here to do. Whereas for the Israelis, the opposite is expected. And it's created very much a fissure, I think, because, for the Israelis, they want to see videos like that of what Hamas is doing, just from the opposite perspective of Israelis killing Hamas. I remember when I watched the video, actually, just for coming here, I was so incensed and I was so angry that I ended up rewatching the video from back in like December, where it was a Yalom soldier. I don't know if you remember the video, where he goes into a house and kills 2 Hamas fighters. Like, he outguns them. And it was such it really felt, you know what I'm talking about?
Yeah.
And when I watched it, I felt this wave of relief rush over me, being like, oh yeah, like, we're also killing them too. I don't know where that comes from. I think, though, it's a purely ego-driven response. This anger of you know what, like, screw you guys, we're just as bad as you. And this is why in insurgencies, terrorism and these kind of videos are so effective, because it prompts the counterinsurgents to do these kind of atrocities, which then the insurgents can use as further proof that the counterinsurgents are bad and evil and XYZ. That's why these kinds of wars are incredibly difficult, because the ego is constantly getting in the way.
Right. And I think it's also something that is shared one way or another between all peoples, especially Israelis and Palestinians during this conflict. You saw a lot of the videos that came out on October 7th, many of which were published by Hamas themselves, where I think some of it can be categorized, or a significant amount can be categorized as centralized psychological warfare operated in a very organized fashion by Hamas. And a lot of it was individual Hamas operatives or random civilians that took part in this massacre on October 7th that I think, quite similar to Israelis, wanted to show how strong they were and wanted to show to their community how much they, as men, can contribute to the quote-unquote national war effort, or the national resistance. And it goes without saying, you can't compare the Israeli videos of soldiers graffitiing homes in Gaza to Hamas terrorists going into people's homes in Israel and kidnapping civilians or raping women. Obviously, the actions here are on completely different scales, and they can't be equated by any means. But I do think that the common denominator in these social media posts, whether it's from members of Hamas or whether it's from IDF soldiers, is this basic desire, especially of men, to say, look at me, I'm stronger than those guys, and I'm going to kill them before they're going to kill me.
War is a very passionate affair. And in today's modern world, like with everything, that passion has to be removed in place of cold, hard logic and rationalization. Whether, again, going back to the business analogy, just because you might be getting bullied by somebody on the other side of the table, if you can still finagle them into a great deal, then you've done your job. But that kind of rationality doesn't work. If someone feels like they're being condescended to or bullied, they'll oftentimes strike back out of ego, and they can blow up a great deal that way. And it's the same in war too. If you're being provoked by the enemy into committing an atrocity, in which will harm your own war effort, in many ways you'll likely do it.
So why don't we, as we finish up this episode, why don't we tie back this conversation to the initial discussion that we had about how ego and honor and pride are likely going to play a role in the Israel-Iran conflict. We spoke quite significantly up to this point about how ego and honor plays a significant role in our personal lives and the lives of individual soldiers on the battlefield. Knowing all that we know now and what we discussed, what's your predictions for what might develop between Israel and Iran?
I think Iran's in a bit of a rock and a hard place in the sense that I don't believe they want a full-scale war. If it comes to a full-scale war, I think there's a strong chance the United States will involve itself in some way, which nobody wants, including the United States. But at the same time, I do believe there's going to be an attack. I think everyone at this point is very confident that there's going to be an Iranian attack, an Iranian response to what happened, just like there was at the death of Soleimani. The Iranians bombed the American embassy in Iraq, and I believe that there were several Americans that were killed in that attack, and I believe something similar is on the horizon for the Israelis as well. I think it will be a much more targeted attack in the sense that I don't think the Iranians are just going to unleash a huge bomb somewhere and just whatever happens. I think it's going to be very much like a measured response. So enough to hurt the Israelis, but not enough to provoke a war. But the Israelis are very passionate people. And even Israel is very much a country that looks at it like you kill one of us and we're going to kill 10 of you kind of thing. And especially, Israel doesn't differentiate between civilians and soldiers in the same way that other countries do, because this is a draft army, because the soldiers are there, all come from the civilian population. It's not separated in the same way that it is with professional armies in a society. So a soldier dying in Israel, they view it very much in the same way as if it was a civilian death, and they take it in that regard. Which for the Israelis, what they do after that, I mean, my guess, another attack. I don't think the Israelis are ever going to be the ones to let the Iranians have the last say.
I think your analysis is precise. I think that's most likely what we're going to see over the next couple days, or maybe even longer, when this attack likely will take place. There was some discussion as to whether or not the Wall Street Journal report about an upcoming attack between 24 to 48 hours is really going to happen. I think that if it wasn't going to happen before that Wall Street Journal article came out, I think now it has to happen, because now everybody's expecting Iran to respond. And speaking about everything that we just spoke about in terms of ego and pride and war, the Iranians can't look at that and be like, okay, you know what? We're going to be strategic about this. I'm going to put our feelings aside. No. They're going to have to do something.
Yeah.
Everybody's waiting for them to do something. It's just a question of whether it's going to be a measured strike, like what you mentioned, and I agree with you, that's the likely scenario, or guns blazing.
Yeah, a mass attack kind of situation. Yeah, I mean, honestly, last weekend I went to bed on Friday night. It was the beginning of Shabbat. Fully expecting there to be an attack. I was fully waiting for the sirens to go off. I was shocked when I woke up on Saturday and there had been no sirens that night. I'll probably go to bed tonight with the same expectation, and we'll just have to kind of wait and see what happens. It is certainly not a relaxing time here in Israel. We'll see what that response is when and if it comes. I mean, at the end of the day, the Iranians might sit on their hands a little bit longer. They're in no rush to attack at this point. I mean, it's been 12 days. I think they're actually enjoying watching the Israelis squirm a little bit and kind of waiting for that attack. I think they also assume that it benefits them militarily as well, to have the Israeli military on high alert and kind of exhausting itself a bit, waiting for the next attack to come. They might even consider themselves in some ways having pulled the Israelis out of Khan Yunis, the Israeli soldiers there. Because they assuming that, okay, these soldiers need to rest in case the attack is so major that we need to open up another front in the north. So for them, the idea they can tie up the Israeli military even further at a time when hostage negotiations are taking place, at a time when the Israeli public is getting completely fed up with the government, at a time of Passover, where, this idea of letting our people free from bondage. I think for the Iranians, there's also a strategic argument to make of just waiting and just letting the Israelis squirm and letting that pressure build and build and build, and hoping that it results in some kind of domestic turbulence that is going to really divide the Israelis.
I think that you may be right. The question is whether or not the Iranians can pitch this strategic gain to their own public as a domestic win for them. And if they can, I think that would be ideal from their perspective.
That's also
the
beauty of being the Iranians is that at the end of the day, you are a totalitarian, fundamentalist government. If you're the Ayatollah, you are the final decision maker. You can have the society can hate you as much as they want. I don't think that they're going to overthrow the Ayatollah if he doesn't commit to an attack right now. He's not responsive to the people in the same way that like Benjamin Netanyahu is or Joe Biden is.
I agree, but I think that as we've seen in other dictatorships, especially ideological dictatorships, they have a certain game to play with their own publics. They are attendant to their own publics, not because they need to be reelected in democratic elections. These elections don't take place in these countries, but they know that if they don't fulfill their own reason for existence as a major ideological force, they might not be removed at the ballot box, but they will be removed by force. And I think that's the...
There is always a concern, you're right, of an internal sort of strike, of a coup. I think even just beyond that, most of them are just megalomaniacs. I think that, honestly, if we really tie it back to ego, if you're a dictator over a country like Russia or Iran, you're just a megalomaniac. Yeah. And I think at that point, this idea of standing down to you is ridiculous. And also because... the reason you are in power is likely because you're a ruthless, game-playing politician who understands a lot of human nature in that vision, in that sense. Before we wrap it up, I guess we'll end this on a good note. It is Passover. Maybe we can find a nice... So a big congratulations to Michael, who has finally, after 90 days, this is your first actual day as a civilian, right?
This is my first actual day as a civilian. I'm back to normal Tel Aviv life.
Yeah, back to the office next week.
Yeah, back to the office next week.
All right, with a smile on his face.
With a big little smile on my face. Yeah, it's
yeah, it's an adjustment. But congratulations to you. You also had a birthday last week. Happy belated.
And Dylan's birthday is tomorrow. We're exactly a week apart.
Exactly right. Yeah, we are 1 week and 1 year apart. Yeah. I'll be celebrating my 32nd with my wife and son, assuming we're not all in bunkers tomorrow. So if the Iranians can hold off for a little bit longer, I'd really appreciate it. And other than that, we just want to wish to everyone who will be celebrating a very happy Passover. Very peaceful Passover as much as you can. And thank you very much for listening. It's deeply appreciated. And we look forward to next time.
Look forward to next time. Have a good one.